Uh, Actually, very naturally. I've attended my last graduation year at Italy, and I've chosen Florence because of this city's incredible cultural legacy. After all, it was the center of one of the greatest artistic revolutions of all times, and it was the cradle of the humanism and the place of rebirth of human reason. On the other hand, the class equivalence gave me an incredible time liberty. With only 2 classes a week and at the center of Europe, I was able to travel through the whole year. So, after a month or so of arriving in Florence, I went into a bookstore with 2 other friends and we found a pocket book with an interesting selection of architecture works around the world that will become our excuse to start our journey. We've got our backpacks and hit the road. We visited hundreds of architecture pieces spread by a dozen countries. We saw a little bit of everything, from churches to museums to financial buildings to square, train stations, even mortuary chapels. Since running from pissed house owners to be welcomed by others, we saw all sorts of buildings and type scales. So this was by far the most important year of my architectural formation. After that, in 2007, I've returned to Portugal and worked as an intern in an architecture office. During that same year, I've started gathering some clients and made my first projects in the available time after work. When I finally finished my intern, I already had assembled a space for starting my work until today. Well, I think we tend to forget that we didn't just pop up from nowhere 6,000 years ago. Life is a kind of response mechanism to the external world. It emerged at 4.5 billion years ago, and through this immense amount of time, it perfected itself and found new ways of responding to the surroundings. Through this process, life sketched the basis of features like the brain or the sensitive organs. So it happened by natural selection. Every once in a while, the genetic code suffers mutations, and the members of a certain species is born with a little difference from this previous. If that mutation is favorable, you will have more chances to reproduce, and as such, will pass his favorable gene to his offspring. And so it goes continuously. When able to do it through a long period of time, the summation of these small mutations eventually leads to the appearance of a new species. So it was through this process that Homo erectus emerged 1.8 million years ago, and eventually it evolved into our own species. So by then humans were already equipped with a highly developed brain and were able to observe and comprehend nature as never before. Eventually, 10,000 years ago, some genius invented agriculture. This was definitely the turning point. We no longer needed to move from one place to another in order to find food. We were able to settle, and this fact led to the appearance of the first civilizations and the rising of the cultural system. So, with the massification of architectural artifacts, we've been sent apart from our natural world, and apparently this made us forget our roots. So now we must recall it. And why? Because it was through this immense amount of time, long before the first civilizations, that life forged our bodies. It's such a huge amount of time that if you spread your arms to the maximum and imagine that the distance between your 2 middle fingers correspond to the entire Earth history, you could annihilate all humanity with a nail rasp. So we have a biological past, and we are what we are because of it. So during the last 10,000 years, the alteration of our biology was merely zero. 10,000 years is nothing for natural selection. So as creators, if we want to produce an assertive design, we cannot base ourselves in the cultural system only. Our history started long before nations have become nations, and if we look a little farther, we'll see that will result in a much more maturated process, and that we aren't so different after all. We are biologically the same. So this is why we say less is more. That manipulation is the foundation of any project of ours. I think you will agree with me if I say that the main objective of any architect is to create spaces that make people feel happier, right? I believe that the only way to getting it done is to understand the basis of happiness. So for that, we must rewind a little. In a very raw definition, the main objective of any living organism is to stay alive in healthy conditions. So, to manage it, life created a regulatory system known as the homeostatic plan that basically defines a sector in which organisms are able to proliferate and their functionality becomes more efficient. It is able to detect not only internal alterations of the physiological conditions, but also external inputs favorable to the organisms. It exists even in the simplest form of life. If even in the ones with no brain, like bacteria, for example, if we introduce a toxic substance in a bacteria environment, they will deviate from the threat and move on the opposite direction. With brain evolution, life refined the ability of detecting those same conditions. At a certain point, it was even able to feel variation as body temperature, smell, taste, tact, audition, and vision. So in order to grant the success and speed reaction of the system, life associated in brains able to produce conscious minds, a reward or punishment mechanism that link every homeostatic level to a specific emotion. So in the end, what we acknowledge as sensation of pleasure or pain, it is actually the representation of a state of a certain living tissue in the organism. So to better understand it, you may think of homeostasis as a linear graphic. In one side, you have the sector that defines the ideal condition levels of the organism's survival, linked to pleasurable emotions, and spread to the rest of the graphic, you will find a gradual representation of the parameters of the internal tissues that deviate us from the ideal levels. These are linked into a series of other sensations that will gradually lead into pain. So each time the brain detects some positive external inputs, you will make you search for it. And the same happens in the opposite direction. If it receives information that the conditions are not inside the homeostatic ideals, it triggers a response mechanism that makes you deviate from the negative input. For example, if you accidentally rest your hand in the stove, the senses in your body will send information to the brain and you will instantly react with a response of deviation from the harmful source. In the end, what we designate as value in terms of objects or actions is directly linked with the management of the homeostatic levels. So in conclusion, the system sets the basis for what we call happiness. But how did life manage to find it, which external inputs were favorable and which ones weren't? It's quite simple. It was able to do it because it had lots of time to learn it. Then, natural selection and genetic heritage made the rest. So, here at the office, when we're creating new spaces, we focus on positively stimulating the homeostatic plan. And how do we do it? We base in the conscious that our sensory organs are the only channels for capturing information from the outside into the brain. And by constantly revisiting our own history, we try to acknowledge every single stimulus that the brain assumed as positive. And why has it done it? Trying to insert the positive ones and cutting off the others in order to induce happiness. You're right, the external world is constantly changing, but as we've seen before, society as we know it is quite recent. So, for the considerate, I will think in human history as divided in two different eras, pre-agriculture and post-agricultural era. 10,000 years ago, before man planted his first seed, he had almost zero influence in the outside world. He would cut off some trees, gather some seeds, but that was basically it. Architecture turned everything around. Farming was further evidence of our potential to shape the world rather than simply react to it. Man was now able to create his own world. Until then, man lived in groups of 200, 300 people, but 6,000 years ago, with the appearance of the first civilizations, the number started increasing exponentially. As population grew, information flew faster, with more people exchanging information, new objects and ideas started sprouting. And with life expectancy increase, cities seem to have gained a life of their own. They have become in some kind of a monster that fed on new ideas and speed. Then, we discovered coal and natural gas as energy source, and industrial revolution occurred. From then on, speed was as never seen before, and with time it got faster and faster. If before industrial revolution human population has never surpassed 1 billion people, today, 150 years later, it has expanded to 7 billion and continues growing. Provisions point at a population of 9 billion in 2020. And now, we need to control it. How can it do if buildings are rigid structures? The thing is that cities are like living organisms. They are the summation of trillions of single cells, and they're in constant regeneration. That same process, it's happening right now in dozens of spots of this same city. And it is constantly an endless transformation of the small constituent parts that we're able to control. The ones that allow us to adapt cities to our own needs. We as architects are the conductors of this repair mechanism. But in order to do it, we must acknowledge how we've got to this point, and that cities are a very recent phenomena. To acknowledge how recent this reality really is, imagine you were able to compress man history into a normal day with 24 hours and consider appearance of the Homo erectus at 0 hour. In this scale of time, the first civilization would have appeared at 11:40 p.m. That's 1 hour and 20 minutes from midnight. For more than 90% of our time, we lived as gatherers and hunters. Our bodies and brains are prepared to a totally different reality. So now, we're living trapped in bodies that are no longer adapted to the surrounding world, and natural selection cannot in any way match the speed of cities' development. So now we must adapt the external world to our bodies, and we must do it by inserting in our creative process the notion that we were created long before cities or even culture as we know existed. So it was during this time that life developed the brain or the sensitive organs, and it was able to select favorable and unfavorable inputs. So through this process of attempt and error, and by the accumulation of experience and genetic heritage, we transmitted this information to the next generation, refining our homeostatic plan. For us, designing a project is the same as solving a problem. We found that the best way to do it is using the Cartesian method, which consists in 4 main steps. First, you must never accept something as real without deeply analyzing it. Second, You must divide a problem in such constituent parts as you can so that you can easily solve them. Third, start solving those same problems, starting from the simplest to the most complex one. And finally, always make such general revisions that you're certain that nothing has been omitted. So, dependently on the project dimension, we always use the same strategy. We analyze identical types, deconstruct them, and reconstruct them again in our own way. And why do we use this method in Prejudice of Another? Because we found that its basic structure is similar to how reasoning process works in your brain. Every idea that you're able to imagine is structured by other ideas or concepts. Each of them is composed by other concepts and so on. So think of a tree, for example. If I ask you to describe it, you will define it from its form and all its constituent parts, like trunk, leaves, roots, etc. Those are the concepts that compose your idea of tree. Now, if then I ask you to define a leaf, you'll use the same strategy all over again. And this could continue indefinitely. So when using the Cartesian method, we're disassembling a global conception into small parts. Because we're cultural beings, we have predefined concepts of everything. Every idea that you have is structured by the ideas of others before you. So if you think in a bakery, for example, the image that will pop up in your mind will be defined by any other bakery that you have ever seen or went. So the only way to create new concepts is to deconstruct the old ones, use the composing pieces that you find of value, and discard the ones that you don't. Link them with your own logic, and voila, you just created a new concept. And if lucky enough, and if it's well assembled, it will be appreciated by others, and it may one day become a cultural preconcept on its own. No. In the bakery project, that stimulus was possible because it was a food facility. Smell and taste were granted by the business itself. Architecture was only able to stimulate vision, tact, and audition. Anyway, I don't think it's possible for architecture to stimulate taste. In that sense, I think it is an incomplete art. But anyway, I cannot recall of any human art that's able to do it rather than cookery. I cannot help to relate the fact that the only two things, at least that I can recall, that can stimulate the all five senses are eating and sexual relations. And the fact that both of them are defined by Maslow as two of our most basic needs. This reinforced the idea that the homeostasis associates pleasure with the most important functions for our survival and proliferation of life. Once again, I think this tells us something about the value that we must give to our biological legacy. I think that when you say art, you're referring to the aesthetic sense. I really think there are two sides of the same coin. For me, there can only be a functional side under every creative decision. Even when the conversation is around aesthetic, because when you try to make a beautiful space, you do it to please the user. Isn't that fulfilling a function? But anyway, aesthetic is of extreme importance when designing a space, because we're designing for people, and people are natural consumers of beauty. It's in our nature. But for me, what really matters is the intelligence behind the creation. As Einstein once said, creativity is intelligence having fun. And it really is. Creativity is nothing but a process of reasoning. And as every reasoning, it must be glued with good logic. If not, just isn't good. But every thought, intelligent or not, has to have a formal representation in order to be understood by others. In writing, It comes in the form of letters and words. In music, it comes in the form of sounds. In architecture, it is instantly perceived by forms and space. Aesthetic is the representation of the reasoning behind the creation, and the better your ability to transmit it to the outside world, the better as artist you become. I actually find them very appealing. Your attitude on reinventing, transforming and reimagining things is based in what I believe to be the only way to innovate. And when looking at Alu portfolio, we cannot help to feel that freshness. Nice clean geometry that results in very sober and empathic designs. Great ambience and light handling, with no extra information to confuse the consumers. In every single design, we see spaces with an attitude, which is important for the brand recognition and to attract the consumers inside. But yet, every space has that interesting ability of letting the displayed products speak for themselves. You really can feel the intelligence behind your designs. We truly try to dedicate the same grade of attention to every project, because each one of them is a possibility that the client is giving us for us to show our thoughts to the world. Of course, we nurture a special joy for every project that gets constructed. Contrary to the painter or the sculptor, that at least in most cases, only depends on his technical abilities to get his work done, in architecture, creative abilities are just a small part of being an architect. Between the idealization of the project and the execution, because of architectural complexity, the whole process is dependent on dozens or even hundreds of technicians, decision boards, and other associated social phenomena. This turns it into a very slow process during which many things can happen. So, when you're able to see the idea you've sketched at that coffee table physically assembled before you, it's quite a magical moment. Well, I will tell them not to forget their own roots and to create based in the notion that we're the product of an evolution with millions of years, and to aim on giving people the right stimuli in order to positively influence their homeostatic levels. The speed imposed by the last 150 years has sent us apart from our natural evolving speed. So, as such, we can no longer ignore the fact that we're living trapped in bodies that aren't prepared for the new, ever-growing reality dominated by architecture. So, as creators of this new reality, we as architects have the obligation to adapt external spaces to our bodies and not the other way around. We must focus on the knowledge of the human body and mainly on the response of the brain to exterior stimuli. We have been creating over a base of incomplete information, supporting ourselves on the last 10,000 years of evolution. That's 5% of our story. So, it is mandatory to integrate the other 95% of primordial informations. Just think of this. If someone gave you a book, do you think it would be reasonable for you to only read the last chapter?